Thanks for the introduction, Vincent. We're really thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Oh, here's the answers in terms of the poll. It looks like 65% of you are parents or guardians of someone with autism. We've got lots of adults with autism and researchers as well. So that's great to see. So I'm what they call principal investigator of Spark. And as from a training point of view or professional point of view, I'm a physician and a scientist, a pediatrician and a geneticist, and really thrilled to have you with us on our 5th year birthday. So I'm going to give folks an update in terms of what we've been up to. It'll only take about 5 minutes. And then most importantly, we want to get to your questions. This is open mic night. So for those of you who participate in Spark, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is your study, and we want to hear from you. That's what tonight's about. It is the largest study of autism, to my knowledge, ever. We have over 275,000 individuals currently in the study. And as many of you know, this is a multidimensional study and is meant to be for a long, long time to see how individuals go through the different life stages of the life course and how things change for them and how some things stay the same. As we do this, we collect information about how you're doing, behavioral information, medical information, and to a certain extent, genetic information, and we'll talk about some of that tonight. We try and make this as easy for you as possible, and so we try and enable you to do this from wherever you are, from home. It can be any place at this point, actually, to be honest, it could be any place around the world, but we do have this US based in terms of those people enroll, and we try and make sure that this is a learning process for you as well as for us. And so we try and share back as much information with you as we can. As I said, we have a huge number of people in the study. This number is even a little dated since we made it, but we're anchored by 31 of the best autism centers around the United States. And many of you, if you see those little dots on over here on the map, you can see the places where we have locations. And as part of this, as I said, we have a genetic component, and over 50,000 participants have already had their DNA sequenced. As we've done this, people have also shared information about themselves or their child or family member. And with that, we've given back individual reports for 70,000 either individuals or 70,000 measures. As we're doing that, as I said, we've been trying to share information from the research community. We do that through a series of newsletters that come out in a monthly way. We have individuals writing stories for the website, 50 webinars that have been given by experts in autism, scientists, physicians, to be able to share with you their experience. And then, as I said, for individual genetic tests results, we give them back for individuals for whom we think we found a significant genetic contributor to their autism. In doing so, we've learned a lot already in 5 years. 5 years, I have to say, admit, has gone by really quickly, at least for me. We now know of over 150 genes that are major contributors to autism, and we have a ginormous number of researchers around the world, not just based in the US, but around the world using the information. All of this information from you is de-identified, so no one knows who you are in terms of doing this, but it allows your contribution to be used again and again and again without bugging you. And I expect that although it's a little under 200 researchers to date, I fully anticipate it's going to be over 1,000 within the not too distant future, just because of how useful the information is and how it spans the entire spectrum, the entire diversity of what we have in the community. I'll also say that we have a program called Research Match, and I know this is something that many of you have participated in, and again, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is an opportunity for researchers around largely the United States to be able to partner with you, to let them know about research opportunities that they have that are different from Spark. They're not actually Spark studies, but they're studies that are done by researchers that we think are good researchers. We review those, we make sure that they're scientifically sound, that they're ethical, that they're worth your time. And for those researchers, then we invite you to be able to see if you'd like to do their research. So we call that a research match. We get you guys together. And as we're doing that, we take it on ourselves to make sure that as those researchers finish their studies, that they report that information back to you. so again, that we're all learning together. And already, to me, it's incredible that we've already had 32 publications in major journals, major scientific and medical journals in just the short 5 years that we've been going. And again, I expect that number to keep growing in a really large way over the next few years. So with this, we're not done yet. I'm not planning on stopping at 5 years. I don't know if it's going to be 50 years or exactly what it's going to be, but it's going to be a long, long time, because we now appreciate just how valuable this resource is for the community. We've realized how successful it's been, how it's helped researchers, how it's helped families. We've heard from so many of you, don't stop, keep going. And so that's what we'd like to be able to do. And we hope you're going to be coming with us along that journey. For me personally, I think it's important for us to understand, as I said, the different life stages that individuals progress through. And I think there are unique things to be learned at each life stage. So I think we really have to, I myself have to be committed to make sure that we're not leaving anyone behind as we're doing that, and that we continue for individuals as they transition, even though they might have started out as children. Our average age at enrollment was 8 years old. And as those folks grow up and become adults, we want to make sure that Spark continues to grow up with them. With this, as I said and alluded to, I hope you can, let me just get this out of the way. We really want to make sure that everyone's represented, that no one's left behind. And as I think about what we'll do in terms of developing supports, educational strategies, behavioral strategies, in some cases medications or other therapies, I feel very, very passionate about the fact that no one should be left behind. And we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be able to be part of those answers for the future. So as we do this, I have some exciting opportunities to talk about. These are not fully worked out yet, so there's still opportunity for you to give us feedback, but we appreciate how important it is to be able to measure behaviors in a natural setting. So not in an artificial setting when someone would come into a research university or a hospital or a clinic. We want to be able to see what's life normally like. And I know that for some of you, there can be, for instance, I can say myself included with COVID, there have been times where I've been anxious, where I've been nervous, and we can think about, we don't always know those what I call internal feelings. Sometimes people may not share those, they may not even be able to express them. And so those internalizing behaviors are really important for me, or those internalizing feelings are important for me to be able to see. And so we've been thinking about ways that we might use devices to be able to track that. So wearables, and some of you may have a smart watch or an Apple Watch or something like that, but it's using some of those types of technologies. Some other types of technologies, so we can see how interactive people are, whether or not they're congregating, interacting, talking, hanging out with other people. And again, with social behavior being a core feature of autism, that'll help us know in terms of what people are like in terms of hanging out. We're doing this in part because, as I said, if we were to have an intervention, behavioral intervention, medication, we need to be able to measure any change that we might see. So we're trying to figure out ways of being able to do that in a simple way for you, not to be able to burden you with doing that. And again, to be able to do that easily from home. So those are the types of things we're thinking about. As we do this, I'm sure that we're going to have more technology over time, other solutions. And again, as we do this, we want to make sure that we're minimally burdensome, maximally effective. So with that, let me pause and I'll stop sharing my screen here so that you can see us. And I think we've got plenty of time for questions.
Yes, so please keep putting questions in. We've already gotten a few, so I'm just gonna start with one. Someone is saying that their 29-year-old daughter was just diagnosed with Bainbridge-Roper syndrome. And so they're curious about what resources are available for adults with this syndrome.
Sure. So it's really timely. I kid you not, just literally last week gave a talk at the American College of Medical Genetics on ASXL3 and BRS, Bainbridge-Roper syndrome. So one thing I'll put a shout out is there's an organization called Leo's Lighthouse, Leo's Lighthouse, and you can just Google it. Leo, I know the family, I know the patient organization extremely well, and they're incredibly supportive and very, very as I said, cohesive and integrated with the research community. There's an incredible group of researchers who are working on ASXL 1, 2, and 3, both in terms of understanding the basic biology and trying to think about how to support individuals better. So Leo's Lighthouse is the place to go.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so we get this question a lot. Someone is asking if you think there would ever be a definitive sort of genetic or biomarker type test for autism.
Okay, so autism really is a behavioral diagnosis. So within medicine, we have criteria, and for autism, it's based on the behaviors that we see. That's just literally the definition and how we've defined it. I get a related question, which is that someone will ask me, such as the participant we just had, in terms of, well, now I've got a genetic diagnosis of Bainbridge-Roper syndrome. Do I have autism? Do I have BRS? What is this going on here? They're not mutually exclusive. So in other words, you could have a genetic diagnosis and you could have a behavioral description of autism. So you're allowed to have both of those. There have been companies that have purported to do things like take a saliva sample, take a blood sample, look at some, not genetics, but look at metabolites or look at something else as a biomarker and see whether or not that could diagnose autism. I'm quite skeptical, I will admit, of all of those. I haven't seen any that have either very good positive predictive value, negative predictive values, sensitivity or specificity, all sort of things we look at for laboratory tests. So I haven't seen any of those that are very good. What I have seen is that there are ways that you can look at how someone's behaving. So you can look at, for instance, eye contact. You can see whether or not someone's connecting, whether they're following you or following people in terms of their activities. Seeing that and seeing that social connectedness, which is really just a way of quantifying behavior, that we can start to see. And so if there was something I were going to use that we're trying to look at that, it would be more an analysis of behavior, but not so far a sort of blood marker, a urine marker, nothing like that that I've seen so far.
Okay. We had a few people asking about if Spark will ever be in other countries outside of the US.
That's a great question. So I will admit that there are individual things, and especially across Europe, that are very specific about data privacy issues, data sharing issues. And so when we started Spark, we actually started in parallel with a group in the United Kingdom, in the UK, and we very intentionally set up some of the data that we collected and how we collected it to be completely parallel, so that we could be doing this in the UK. It could also, or rather, we were doing this in the US, it could be done in the UK, with the idea that even though we were separate studies, we could eventually, or researchers really could eventually combine the data and have comparable data sets. We've continued to encourage other researchers in other parts of the world to establish things that are Spark-like, using some of our lessons learned, both the good and the bad, I'll admit, in terms of what we've learned over these 5 years. But right now we're based in the US, and I can make the commitment for the US, but I encourage other folks around the world to set up parallel studies to Spark.
Okay. Someone is asking about if there's any connection between bipolar disorder and autism.
Oh, very good question. So when you think about the brain and behavior, not everything is sort of very circumscribed. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of just individuals who can have excuse me, different types of behaviors, and especially over the life course, different stressors can change, different periods of life can change. And so when we've looked at the genetics as well, interestingly, some of the genetics can be similar for not just autism, but may be shared with other conditions. And so I'll just give you one example. I mentioned it already, but anxiety is a common symptom that we see in individuals with autism. I won't say everyone, but very common. Excuse me, we also see problems in terms of not necessarily bipolar, but depression more commonly that we can see associated with that. And then there are individuals with schizophrenia, bipolar, other types of psychiatric conditions. when I look at the frequency of overlap, bipolar is not common in terms of being overlapping with autism. I'm not saying it can never happen, but it's not one of the common things that we see in terms of overlap. And again, within that, just for people who may not know the terminology, bipolar is people who at sometimes in their life are depressed or very sad, and at other times are what we call manic, or sort of in a different state. Rather than being very low, they're very high. And so again, it can be seen, but it's not the most common association.
And what about any kind of overlap between autism and seizures?
Autism and seizures is actually very common that we see an overlap. So individuals with autism can have seizures, and most individuals will have seizures when they're little, so starting within the first, say, 3 years of life. But there are a few people that don't have seizures until they get to adolescence. And when adolescence and puberty kicks in, hormones kick in, your body's changing in all sorts of ways. And there are a few people that won't have had seizures before, but will have seizures for the first time during adolescence. If you get through that period of life, though, so if you end up, sort of 17, 18, and you haven't had seizures by that point, it's not likely that seizures are going to start anew unless something happens, like you're in a car accident or have some sort of head trauma or something like that, just like anyone else could. But yes, seizures are not infrequent for individuals with autism.
So someone is asking about siblings. So how likely would it be that a sibling of someone with autism could have a child with autism?
Okay, I think I got the question. I'll say a couple things and then I'll repeat the question to make sure I got it right.
Yeah.
So there's something that I think many of you are aware of, which is that autism is more common in boys or in males than it is in females. And so that ratio overall is about 4-to-1, males to females. Depending on where you are along, I'm going to call a spectrum for autism spectrum disorder. If you're at the what some people call higher end of the functioning sort of spectrum, that ratio may be more like 8-to-1. And if you're at the more profound level, where you have more problems in terms of individuals who, for instance, may be nonverbal or not talk, and have more problems, even in some cases in terms of walking, that ratio can be closer to even 1-to-1 males to females. So you can see there are differences along that spectrum. The reason I bring this up is because when you ask about, the risk to certain people in the family, it is somewhat related to the sex of those individuals. So for instance, if you're asking about a sibling, you have to specify, is it a male sibling? Is it a female sibling? If you're specifying that sibling's child, you also have to specify, is it going to be a male child or a female child? So it gets that's why I'm giving that level of specificity. One question some people ask me is if I have, let's just pretend I and my partner have had one child we have one child, and that one child has autism, and now I'm thinking about having a second child. What's the chance that I would have another child with autism, assuming that first child, for instance, is a boy? And that risk can go up to 20%. And so that risk is, not insubstantial in terms of that risk, or at least some people feel that that's not insubstantial. And that risk is higher if that second child would be a boy versus whether it would be a girl. And so in a similar way, though, the farther you get away genetically or within the family from the individual with autism, that risk goes down pretty dramatically. And so if you're talking about a sibling, for instance, especially a sibling who seems to have no behavioral or mental health issues, really has nothing else going on, that risk can fall down pretty significantly to be low single digits. So, something like 3-4%, much less than that 20%, as I said, for that parent of the first child. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was really helpful. Related to that, we're getting questions about what kinds are, so how genetics can be related to autism in families. Is it hereditary? Or are there other things going on?
Great question. And this is one that I admit can be very confusing, because genetics, it sounds like it should run in families, right? So there are two distinctly different, when I think of genetics of autism, there are sort of two different buckets that I think of. So Within, and let me try and point this out. So we return about 10% of Spark families currently. About 10% of you have a genetic finding that we see that we're very certain is a major contributor to the autism in your family. And so we return that information to you. For most of the individuals, not all, but most of the individuals that we currently recognize that in, those are genetic changes that are de novo or new in the individual with autism. And so what I mean by that is it's not something that's in the mother's sample that was sent in. It's not something in the father's sample that was sent in that we see. Then it seems to have started first with the individual with autism. So that's genetic, but it was not inherited. So it didn't come down from mom or dad, but it is genetic in the individual with autism. Now, for that individual with autism, if they were to go on and have children their own, they would have 2 copies of that gene, one copy that seemed to have the usual sequence and then one that had a different sequence. And it's a 50-50 chance of passing down either the regular version of the gene or the one that's different. And so that would have a high risk, a 50-50 risk of having that individual with autism themselves passing that down to their child. So that's one scenario. That's one bucket of things. I just realized I'm out of focus, but hopefully I'll get in focus in a second. There's another bucket of genetic changes which are inherited, or sometimes we use the word transmitted. That is, they come from a parent and come down. And those can come in a couple different flavors. Some are on what we call the X chromosome, or some people call it the sex chromosome. And in that case, oftentimes it's coming from the mother's side, coming down, and often present in a boy. We don't see that all that often, but that's one type of inheritance that we can see. Sometimes we see inheritance where I say it takes 2 to tango. It takes a little something from the mom, a little something from the dad, and the 2 of those in just the right combination. And then, although we don't see it as frequently, as at least we don't recognize it, I should say right now, there are cases where it seems to have one factor that's coming from one parent. And I would suspect that in some of those cases, there's another factor coming from the other parent that we're not recognizing yet. So again, it's kind of 2 different factors coming from the 2 parents, but both inherited. So I know that was complicated, but I hope that explains that there can be genetic factors that are both new in the individual as well as inherited from a parent.
Okay, so this next question is a little bit about the research process. So someone is wondering how we obtain consent from children to provide a DNA sample.
Oh, that's a good question. So within this, we really trust parents. And I would say, one of the things that, people I think wondered about was, could parents or guardians accurately report information? And although this isn't a direct answer to the question, I'll say that I had faith in parents knowing, and again, as a pediatrician working with a lot of parents, that they could accurately report information, that they could actually report if their child had autism and could report other information to us. And I have to say, at the beginning, there were skeptics out there. I'm glad they were wrong, because we've actually done that and gone back to see, were parents accurate in reporting their child's diagnosis of autism? And the answer is absolutely close to 100%. They're also accurate in reporting other information about what their child is capable of doing, special challenges, other diagnoses that they might have. So that's been really important to be able to show that we can get information in this way, because it opens up the opportunity to participate for many more individuals. Now, the second part of that is that to do this, we enabled parents to be able to sort of supervise this process. So in other words, what I mean by all of this being done online, so it can be done on your tablet, on your computer, on your smartphone, and we have these consents that are electronic consents. So they're no longer paper and pencil, but it's someone who's signing and attesting to this information. We expect, especially for individuals with autism, that parents may need to help those individuals to be able to either assent, if they're minors, if they're not 18 yet, to be able to say that yes, they give permission to be part of this research, or there are some individuals who are over 18, but they're not independent adults. And so again, those parents would have to be able to provide that permission. So within this whole process, the parents are really the ones that are helping to facilitate this process in terms of that either assent or the consent.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research that Spark engages with? So, there's different models of autism. There's a medical model of autism, and there's all kinds of other kinds of research. So, does basically does Spark do all different types of research? I think is the main question the person is asking.
Yeah, so I think so Spark, I'm going to distinguish these in two different ways. There's kind of what I think of as Spark, doing Spark Central is the way I call it. So the work that's coming directly from Spark. And then there's also this research match mechanism. So the idea that Spark is really, a matchmaker in terms of being able to put researchers and families together. Within this, there is all type of research that's done by researchers using Research Match, as well as what Spark is doing centrally. There's actually more research done by Research Match and other researchers that are doing things than by Spark Central itself. So at this point, like I said, over 100 researchers being able to do this. They've looked at everything from vaccine hesitancy to one of the big things that we've done at Spark Central during COVID is actually understanding what the impact of COVID has been on our community, both adults with autism as well as younger folks with autism, being able to see exactly how much in-person therapy, education was going on, how much families were in crisis, how that's changed over time, what attitudes have been in terms of vaccines, issues that have been coming up. And again, sharing back that information with the community and help, I hope, in terms of even public policy for people to be able to recognize what the issues were and make sure that our voice is heard within the community and within the public square. So with this, I don't think of that, for instance, about what was happening to our community during COVID. I don't really think of that per se as a medical thing. I mean, we asked people, did you have any trouble accessing your doctor, getting to the emergency room? We asked those types of things. But as we frame this, we don't really think of, we don't frame autism as a medical condition per se in terms of doing that. It's a difference, we're all different. If otherwise the world would be really boring if we were all the same. So it's a difference.
Another question related to genetics. Do you think at some point we'll get to a place where something like chromosomal microarray or exome sequencing would be sort of standard of care for individuals with an autism diagnosis?
Yep. So let me be clear. No one has to have genetic testing. It might sound sacrilegious coming from me as a geneticist, but this is an option. If it's something that you're going to find helpful, then that's great. If not, that's fine too. It is already the case in the United States, and I assume most of our viewers are in the United States, that you should have access to some type of genetic testing for autism. I realize that it may feel harder than it is, but there are many of us who have advocated very strongly in terms of public policy to make sure that this is a covered benefit by Medicaid, by insurance companies, different states in terms of their policies. So we've worked really hard and written very publicly so that there will be medical justification if you need to have an appeal with your insurance company or whatever it might be. So that paper trail, so to speak, is out there. I do this all the time. I only practice in the Northeast and a couple states here. But at least when I do it, I would say my batting average is about 99% in terms of being able to get insurance coverage for both exome sequencing and chromosome microarray specifically for an autism diagnosis. So if you do want to, get the clinical test, if you're having trouble, do advocate, do ask that you can see specifically a genetic counselor, a geneticist. And these days we can do a lot by telehealth. I'll also say that's one of the benefits of COVID, is that you might find it easier to be able to access resources without having to drive 6 miles, or 6 hours rather, to your local center to see a genetic doctor like myself. So ask, and if they ask where you came up with this crazy idea, blame it on me. Say that I listened to this Wendy Chung on Spark and she told me that I should ask for this. And anyway, they'll come back to me and I'll help them if we need to.
Okay. Let's see. Thank you all for all these questions. I'm sorting through everything, trying to find some trends if I can. This is always a popular one. Can you talk a little bit more about the DNA analysis process, sort of what goes into that, and why someone might see that their sample's been completed, that the sequencing has been done, but they haven't heard back from us?
Sure. So within this, there's many processes or many steps in the process. And I know it takes a long time, and I know many of you have been patient. And as I was saying before, if there is some urgency for whatever reason, do use the clinical resources, seeing a doctor, seeing a genetic counselor, and having them do this in a, faster way than we do on the research side. Within this, we look at everyone's samples. So I want to be clear, everyone is going through this whole pipeline that I'm about to describe. As we do this, we have, we extract the DNA from the saliva sample that you've sent in, and we do this process I described of chromosome microarray as well as exome sequencing. It's all with the same intention, to find genetic factors related to autism. Some look at things that just happen to be larger in terms of the size of the DNA, some of them smaller, but that's the only reason why we look at both of those. For some of you, you may ask, well, why did you ask, not just my son with autism, but why did you ask me and my partner, to both send in samples? And as we make that request because we do a comparison. We do a comparison between both the parents and the child. And as I was alluding to before, that allows us to very efficiently and quickly see if there's something genetically new in the child that isn't in either of those two parents. It's not that you have to have a complete trio, is the way we describe it, to be in Spark or to have your genetic information analyzed, but it does help us to recognize the things that are new more quickly and more effectively if we have both parents available. If we don't have either parent, of course, we can't see that something's new in the person with autism because we don't have any comparison. As we do that and as we go through, we're looking at a specific set of genes that we know are related to autism initially. So when we started Spark, as an example, we didn't know about 150 genes that were associated with autism. We had a much more modest list of about 50 genes that were associated with autism. And we'd look through those 50 genes and we'd see if we see any particular genetic variants in those genes that look like the types of changes that we associate with autism. When we do, we double check. Everything we send back, we've looked at not just once, but we've looked at twice, and we've had an independent group look at it to verify and confirm anything that we believe might be related to autism, so that you've got a built-in second opinion. As we do that, as I said, we're returning that information. Now, on the other hand, we at the beginning may have only said, let's say it was 7-8% of people that we recognized something. For that other 93% of individuals, we put everyone's information together, and then we started looking to see if we could see patterns not just for one family, but patterns across families. If we saw, for instance, a new gene that wasn't previously related to autism, and we saw it not just in one family, but 2 or 3 or 5 or 15, but we were looking again for that pattern and seeing it over and over. And as we did see that and became statistically more confident of that, we could say, aha, I now recognize this gene as being related to autism. Now we're going to go back and look at everyone in Spark, look at that particular gene, and see if we see a change that we think would change the function of that gene in a way that was related to autism. And then for anyone across Spark with that new gene that we see something, then move that and return that back to the families after going through that second independent analysis. And so we've done that over and over and over again. And at this point, as I said, we're about 10% of the families where we've gotten to the point with something that we're quite certain and we feel confident, and we've had a second independent group confirm that for us. But we're not finished yet, because the more people we have and the more that we learn, not just at Spark Central, but that we learn from other conditions, as people develop better statistical models to look at data like this, as we do all sorts of things that some of you won't understand what I'm saying, and I apologize, but things where we look at how the brain is developing and changing over time and what happens to the expression of genes in different cells, all sorts of information that we're bringing together to understand this. that number is growing. And so we're, if you're keeping a scorecard now, we're at 10%. I fully expect that by the within the next 5 years, by our next anniversary, that we should have doubled that number, that we should be at approximately twice as many genes that we know about that are related to autism. Hope that helps.
Okay, here's an interesting question. So if a parent is suspicious that they may have autism and they participate in Spark, and of course their child does have a diagnosis, does that complicate Spark's research if it ends up showing that the parent maybe has the same gene change as the child, but doesn't have an autism diagnosis officially?
Yep. So that's a great question. It's one of the things that whoever thought this, it's quite insightful. And it's one of the things that we've started struggling with. So I alluded to this briefly, a couple things. So one thing is that we're now starting to look at inherited variants, so things that are being passed down from parent to child. And we're recognizing, again, because we've got such large numbers, we're recognizing that we're seeing certain genes where we're seeing inherited changes that we would have predicted change the way the gene works. And we're seeing it more so in, for instance, our individual with autism and Spark, compared to, in some cases, we have another sibling who doesn't have autism. So when we do that comparison between the two, or if we do the comparison of what a parent does pass down to the child with autism versus what they don't pass down to the child with autism. So in several cases, we've noticed that a couple things. So number one, as you can imagine, that a generation ago, autism was not a diagnosis that was made nearly as commonly. I'm not saying that it didn't exist, but it wasn't something that people recognized. It wasn't something people people got that label or got that diagnosis. So there are many adults going around and they're perfectly fine, but they have autism, but no one has necessarily said exactly that it's autism. They are who they are. I think individuals, now that their children are being diagnosed, sometimes sit back and they say, you know what, I had some of those challenges, but when I was growing up, we didn't call it autism. I was who I was. And so I've had several adults come to me and said, if I were growing up today, I think I probably would have been diagnosed with autism because I've shared some of the same features my son or my daughter had. So I think that is the case, and we're seeing that. I will say that makes it a little bit more challenging for us to ascribe attribution to those, or to say that we think those are related to autism, because I get kind of confused. When I see that, I say, wow, that's coming from a parent who says that they don't have autism and they don't have anything, other in terms of other behavioral differences. Could that be right? Could that be really associated and it's just a weak factor where it doesn't always equal autism? That's one possibility, is it's a risk factor. It increases the chance, but it's not deterministic. It's not like you have this change and therefore you will have autism. So sometimes that puzzles us. And as a result, we're less likely to be able to promote that to one of the autism genes. It kind of sits over here in a watch list that we have, where we're watching carefully and we're waiting to see, will we get enough statistical evidence? In some cases, what we've observed also is that a parent may not say they have autism, but we've noticed some parents that have other challenges, other behavioral differences or other things where they'll say, for instance, I have problems with attention, I have problems with ADHD, I may have other psychological issues in terms of, someone mentioned bipolar, but bipolar or other behavioral sort of psychiatric conditions. And so we have noticed for those individuals, things may have been a little bit rougher. They may have had some other challenges, although it wasn't autism, and some of those genetic factors may make them susceptible to other types of behavioral diagnoses. So within this, it gets complicated quite quickly. And I think this is something that we're going to be teasing apart for a while to come. I will say that you may see us send out questionnaires for parents about how you're doing. So you might say, well, why are you bugging me? I mean, we're doing this for my child with autism, and absolutely we are. But some of that is trying to understand some of these very subtle questions that you're asking about tonight.
Okay. We have a few people writing in about that have children who are nonverbal, and they're wondering if there are any evidence-based treatments or therapies that might help individuals that are nonverbal to speak or learn to speak.
Yeah. So I have to admit that I learn so much from my patients. And I think I was really, when I think back to, Spark is 5 years old. When I think back to 25 years ago, when I started doing this, I have to admit there was so much that I didn't appreciate that I now have started to appreciate, specifically around kiddos who are nonverbal or minimally verbal. The first is that by having the ability to watch them and watch them carefully, and especially the younger generation that's growing up, I can appreciate just how much they understand, how much they're processing, how much they're learning. And I can remember very distinctly my first patient when I realized that he could read, because, there were literally, I was having trouble communicating with him, but I could tell that he was reading things and understanding them and able to follow instructions with written words. And it was kind of an aha moment for me in terms of how much capacity there was, but simply talking. The mechanics of talking and articulating are quite complicated. The way you use your lips and your tongue, and you swallow and you blow air through your nose, that whole complex motor planning is quite challenging. So to be able to make it easier to get the words out, so to speak, it doesn't have to be through the mouth, but many of you use, I'm sure, assisted communication devices. So it can be from its most simplistic way, literally pointing, signing, gestures, word cards, communication devices and boards, eye gaze in terms of being able to see basically a picture board, but moving with your eyes. There are all sorts of creative things that can be done. I will say, for those of you who may have younger children, or at least children who are mentally younger and learning still to talk, one of the things that I've done quite frequently with my patients is to do words to songs. So what I mean by that is being able to use music as a medium that a lot of children like, not everyone, but a lot of children like. And by doing that, you actually take two different parts of the brain, part of the brain that's responsible for verbal language, and then part that's responsible for music, and you kind of double down. You take two different sources of brain power and get them to work on the same function, and that memory seems to stick longer. And you can also go through repetition in terms of, I call it toddler tunes, but whether it's toddler tunes or other songs that you can just repeat over and over and over again, and working with a speech and language pathologist or speech therapist in terms of focusing on specific mouth movements that you want within that specific song, so that you can repeat those over and over and get that motor memory going in terms of learning that particular way the mouth and the teeth and the lips and the tongue all work together. In doing that, and the other thing, or the other reason I like doing it to music, is you can make it fun. It doesn't have to be like therapy. It doesn't have to be like work. You can do it in the car. You can do it at bath time. You can do it in lots of more fun way. You can dance, but you can use hand motions. But whatever you can do, you can get more repetition, more of that therapy in, and I find that quite helpful. I think the point is, though, don't assume that your child doesn't understand and doesn't know what's going on. I think you'll be quite surprised at how capable they are, but you've got to give them the chance.
Okay, so another question we got is in regard to screening tools for mental health conditions. So are the same screening tools used for individuals with autism, or are there specific instruments that might be used for individuals with ASD?
So we have standardized screening measures that we do that are oftentimes questionnaires. And so we have things that you may have even seen in Spark. We have something called the Child Behavior Checklist, which gets a sense of a child's behaviors and can tell us whether or not they're in, we call it a clinical range, but a range in which there's something that we recognize as being different from, quote unquote, the average person. So there are those standardized instruments, and they aren't specific necessarily to autism. The biggest challenge for me, I alluded to it earlier, but the biggest challenge I have is that some individuals, and I'll say especially girls or females with autism, will tend to keep emotions inside. They'll tend to keep them sort of to themselves. Part of this is just because, you know, with autism, people tend to be more sort of keeping things to themselves. And they won't necessarily, depending on their level of verbal ability, they won't necessarily articulate that or say, I'm sad or I'm anxious or whatever it is that they might be feeling. And so sometimes you have to be able to get other cues. You as sort of Dr. Mom or Dr. Dad who know your child best might be the one that appreciates when they just seem to be off their game or they seem to be exploding. Sometimes that explosion or emotional overload comes from either anxiety about a situation and not knowing how to process everything, and just that frustration that comes with either being confused or literally just overwhelmed in terms of what's going on. So with this, and again, it's somewhat of a limitation of our diagnosis codes in terms of being able to put labels on things. I think what's more important to me is to be able to say, what behaviors are you observing? What seems to be the triggers? If those are problem behaviors, what seem to be the trigger of those behaviors? And if they're disruptive, you know, what can you do to be able to modify that behavior? Probably even more so, more important than being able to put a specific label on it.
Can you talk a little bit more about seizures? So individuals with ASD, could they develop seizures later in life? And then similarly, if an individual with autism had seizures early in life and they stop, could they come back? I know that's kind of a broad question, but
Yep. Yep. So I will say that one of the reasons that I do feel that it's important for the genetics, so let me digress and I'll answer this question, but I'm going to answer some others as well. The nice thing about the genetics is it gives us a better idea of the roadmap or the prognosis associated with the condition. So whether it's ASXL3 or some other alphabet soup of a gene that might be involved, we have some sense of what tends to happen, when it tends to happen, how frequently it tends to happen, and if there's anything we can do about it. And so by having that, you know, kind of guide, I find it quite helpful, because then I don't have to just say in general terms, could anyone with autism have seizures? I can say more specifically, you know, does anyone with the SHANK3 variant potentially have seizures? And if they do have seizures, importantly, is there a medication that seems to work more effectively for that? Or what was implied by your question, are there some people who are going to grow out of their seizures, you know, where individuals, they might need medication for some period of time, but maybe by the time they're going to kindergarten, they're outgrowing their seizures and they don't need to have medication anymore. So I will say, for those of you who may have an individual with autism and seizures, that combination there is more likely to be a genetic diagnosis. So of those 10% that I talked to, that is disproportionately represented both by individuals who have epilepsy, seizures, as well as individuals who tend to have problems in terms of cognition, so developmental delay or intellectual disability. That tends to be overrepresented in the individuals who have a genetic diagnosis. Within this, it is the case that there are some people that will have seizures and it's really lifelong. It's a permanent problem. And oftentimes those are very central problems with the brain and the way the brain cells talk to each other, or with what we call channels, the electricity that goes from one brain cell to the other. Those, again, there are some individuals lifelong, they will have seizures like that. Other individuals that I've known for many of the genetic conditions I've dealt with will have seizures early, but then there really is a chance, very good chance, that the child will outgrow those seizures even without medication. It is not as common, but we can see it, that you won't see seizures within those first 2 to 3 years of life. But again, the most common time I see them again is when we go through puberty. With the changes that are happening with the body at that point, there are things that seem to get kind of out of balance. And with that, some issues that come with seizures as well.
um, so we were talking earlier about there being many more boys that are diagnosed with autism, and someone is asking if there's any relation to genetics. So, you know, in research, it's often called a female protective effect. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there's one factor that people have wondered about. I talked about sex chromosomes or X chromosomes. So along the X chromosome, so just let me back up a step. So for males, they have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. For females, they have two X chromosomes. So females, in a way, you could say, well, maybe the protective factor for females is they've got a double dose of the X chromosome. They've got an extra copy to cover up or to take care of things if there's a problem on one X chromosome. And so for a certain number of people, that is the case. That is that there are genes on the X chromosome that have to do with autism and related neurological conditions. And females tend to be protected from those X chromosome conditions in general, whereas they're more frequent in males. And so that's part of the difference, but it's not the majority of the difference of what we've seen between males and females with autism. It's interesting because some people have talked about, a real phenomenon versus is there something in terms of there might be differences between males and females, but maybe females manifest it in a different way. And so we have, again, this behavioral label for males in terms of social interactions, need for sameness. We call that autism, but you could have some similar features. And if a female, for instance, just were to be more socially engaged with others for whatever reason, but maybe have some of those same concerns for need for sameness, need for consistency, and getting anxious. If that weren't the case, maybe they get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. So it might be some similar feelings inside, but maybe in males it erupts and they have a tantrum and it's something that you can see very visibly. Maybe in females they have some of those same feelings, but maybe they manifest them in a different way. And so it's not recognized or not called autism. Still differences and still maybe some similar things that will trigger those behaviors, but they might be labeled in a different way. So those are some of the explanations we think of. I will also be very honest, we don't know. We don't know the answer for the majority of the reasons why males or females, or their hormonal differences, or the hormonal differences even during development of the brain. We really don't know for the most part what those differences all are.
Okay. So you were talking about ASXL3 earlier, and so a lot of these gene changes are considered rare. So as genetic testing becomes more accessible and available and more people participate in research, do you think some of these things that we consider rare now might not be so rare?
Absolutely, the answer is yes. Singing to the choir here. Let me give you a couple statistics. Rare conditions are individually rare, but collectively common. About 10% of the US population has a rare genetic condition. For many individuals, these conditions are so new that they simply have not been recognized before. So for instance, I mean, I was talking about this is our 5th year anniversary, right? The majority of the genes that we know of today that are associated with autism, we didn't know when we started Spark. That's how quickly things are changing. So you can imagine if you weren't part of Spark and you were a 10-year-old and had autism, you probably maybe, your parents or you as parents were thinking about what caused the autism right after the time of diagnosis. So maybe at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, but maybe at the age of 10, you haven't been asking that question. So you wouldn't have gone and asked your pediatrician or asked your behaviorist or asked someone about the genetics. You still have that condition. It's still in your DNA. You simply haven't opened that envelope to be able to see what that diagnosis is. So that's potentially true of someone 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, all through that lifespan. And in fact, we have a dearth of information for individuals who are over the age of 25 with these rare genetic conditions. I know they're out there because sort of in a circumferential way, I've found them and they found me, but there are many, many more of them out there. They're simply not as well organized in a way that, or nor are they thinking necessarily about joining a genetic study or getting a genetic diagnosis through a doctor. And so as a result, they're kind of out there. They're doing their thing, but they're out there and not necessarily recognized. I do bring this up though, and I'll bring this up for some of you that may have sort of young adults or older adolescents. I can say that for some of those adults, I've been learning an awful lot that I think is really important for our kids as we think about them getting older. I've realized that for some of these conditions, they're associated with an increased risk of cancer. For some of them, I realize that it's not just, sort of steady. You are sort of always stable and will always be that way. I've seen some of these conditions now associated with Parkinsonism, other conditions that we think of in terms of more sort of adult neurological conditions. And it's the same condition, it's just at the later sort of older ages for these individuals. So the reason I mention this is because for many of I often think of many of my own patients who are now getting to the point where they're getting to be 18, 19, 20, and they're starting to see a new set of doctors. They're going through this transition to becoming young adults. And I'm finding it very helpful if I can give as much salient advice to those new therapists, those new doctors, the new team that starts taking over their care about what to expect, that prognosis we talked about, what to expect, what they're going to need, how to tailor their care. And if there is something like an increased risk of cancer or an increased risk of diabetes, I want to make sure that those doctors are screening for those things, catching those things early, making sure that if they come up, they're treated, because I worry that many of our young people with autism may not either just be able to advocate for themselves. There's some people who, especially if they're nonverbal, can't do that, or they may not feel comfortable seeing doctors. And so there may be delays to these diagnoses. And as I said, I don't want anything that can be prevented to be left out. I want to make sure that all of our community members are getting the best care that they can. As we've been with my own practice, I've been doing a lot of, like I said, transition and making sure that that transition is smooth and that we're setting folks up in terms of these lifelong care plans.
Okay, so we probably only have time for maybe one or two more. You talked about this earlier, but we got a few more questions, so maybe we had some new people join. Can you just talk a little bit more about sort of the chances of someone who has a diagnosis of autism having a child with autism?
Sure. So for someone who themselves has a diagnosis of autism, it becomes important to make a prediction about their child to understand what their individual genetic cause is, if anything, that can be identified. So what I mean by that is that we call it risk of recurrence. So if I have autism, what's the chance that my child would have autism? Coming up with that number could be relatively small to up to 50%. And to be able to be more specific and more accurate, it becomes incredibly important to go this process of genetic testing as comprehensive as possible to be able to see, is there an identifiable genetic factor? And if so, to be able to say, is this something that when it gets passed down, it's 50%, or in some cases, there are certain genetic factors where the risk to the next generation could literally be zero. And so that number in terms of that range 0 to 50, most people find it helpful to have greater specificity than say, Dr. Chung, 0 is a lot different than 50. Like, you got to give me some better numbers here. So with that, that's how we oftentimes will use the genetic testing.
Okay, these ones are super quick. Does it cost any money to be involved with Spark?
Spark is even better than free. We pay you. I say that a little facetiously, but no, we do respect your time and your dedication. And so we acknowledge that with a small token of appreciation with a gift card for some of the activities as part of Spark.
Okay, and last one, is Spark still recruiting?
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. So Spark is continuing to recruit individuals with autism, their family members. We want to make sure everyone has the chance to participate. It's really important to me that everyone has the chance for their voice to be heard, for them to contribute, for them to influence the research and hopefully the direction that we're taking to help support our community with autism.
Okay. All right. Well, we're out of time here. Thank you to everyone that joined us. And thank you, Wendy, for answering all these questions. I know that everyone really appreciates it.